All right, so let's dive right into this.
Yeah.
You shared some really interesting sources with us about President-elect Trump's proposed changes to the U.S. election system.
Right.
A Newsweek article
Yep.
and a pretty heated Reddit discussion.
Yeah, very heated.
So we'll be unpacking his four-point plan, exploring potential impacts,
Right.
and raising some critical questions for you at home to think about.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly interesting considering the timing of this whole announcement.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Trump chose to unveil this plan while accepting the Patriot of the Year award at a Fox Nation event.
Definitely a way to make a splash with a plan like this.
For sure.
And he didn't hold back on the details at all,
No, he didn't.
saying, and I quote, "We're going to do things that have been really needed for a long time, ... And we are going to look at elections. We want to have paper ballots, one-day voting, voter ID, and proof of citizenship." Pretty big stuff.
Yeah, and this actually echoes some points that he made earlier this year during a speech in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Oh, really?
Yeah, so it seems like this has been brewing for a while.
Interesting. Okay, so it's not just like a spur-of-the-moment kind of thing.
Doesn't seem like it.
Okay, so let's break it down, starting with paper ballots.
Yeah.
Seems pretty basic on the surface.
Well, it does, until you consider that according to the Brennan Center, nearly every county in the U.S. already uses paper ballots in some form.
Oh, wow. So almost everyone is already doing that.
Yeah, so that makes you wonder, what's the real agenda here? Why is
Yeah.
he emphasizing this point?
Yeah, why is that at the top of the list? That's interesting. Okay, so next up, he wants a return to one-day voting.
Uh-huh.
This one seems particularly significant just given the growing trend towards early and mail-in voting,
Yeah.
especially after that huge surge we saw in 2020.
Right. And in 2024 alone, over 88 million Americans cast their ballots through mail-in or early voting.
Wow.
And 47 states currently allow some form of early voting.
Okay, so this would be a really drastic shift in the opposite direction.
And the Reddit thread you shared highlights some serious concerns about what the consequences of a move like that would be.
Right.
A lot of people are expressing concern about disenfranchisement, especially for people in rural communities who rely on early voting.
Yeah, and that's especially concerning when you look at swing states.
Right.
Those states that could go either way in an election. Rural voters in those states often utilize early voting.
Right.
And a shift to a single voting day could really impact their participation.
Yeah, and also, just thinking about the Reddit thread, folks are worried about the impact on disabled voters who benefited from mail-in voting in 2020.
Right.
And logistically, going back to one-day voting
Yeah.
seems like it could be a nightmare just with those long lines, especially in densely populated urban areas.
It's a big concern.
Working people who are already pressed for time might find it incredibly difficult to vote if that's the only option.
Yeah, it would definitely raise a lot of practical challenges.
All right, well, let's move on to the proposals for voter ID and proof of citizenship. Another set of issues that are generating a lot of debate.
For sure.
And these aren't entirely new concepts either.
Right.
Currently, 35 states require some form of government-issued ID to vote in person,
Right.
with 24 of those requiring a photo ID.
Mm-hmm.
And this trend towards stricter voter ID laws has been gaining momentum.
It really has. Just since 2020, 8 states have enacted new voter ID laws.
Wow, and the Reddit discussion you shared brings up a lot of anxieties surrounding these requirements, particularly the concern that they could disproportionately disenfranchise non-white voters.
Yes, that's a major concern.
It can be challenging for certain groups to obtain the necessary documentation,
Right.
and that could create a real barrier to voting.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because you see these contrasting approaches playing out across the country.
Yeah, like what?
For example, California recently passed a law preventing local governments from requiring voter ID at the polls, which Trump very publicly criticized.
Right.
So it really highlights this ongoing tension between those who believe stricter measures are necessary for election security
Right.
versus those who see them as potential tools for voter suppression.
Okay, so some people think it's about security. Other people think it's about preventing people from voting.
Exactly. It's a really complex situation.
Yeah. Definitely no easy answers there. All right, well, speaking of complex, we have to talk about Trump's history with mail-in voting.
Yeah.
It's been complicated.
To put it mildly, his past actions definitely paint a certain picture.
Right.
He very actively fought against efforts to expand mail-in voting in 2020. He even went so far as filing lawsuits to stop changes that would make it easier to vote by mail.
Wow.
And he was very vocal in his criticism, calling mail-in ballots dangerous
Right.
and corrupt,
Yeah.
and even blaming them for his loss in 2020.
Right, but then this year, it's like he did a complete 180.
It really does seem that way.
He's encouraging encouraging his supporters to vote early, including by mail. It's really confusing what motivated this change of heart. Or is it more strategic than that?
It's an interesting development for sure, and it's not just him.
Really?
Yeah, Laura Trump, his daughter-in-law and a co-chair of the Republican National Committee, has also been actively encouraging early and mail-in voting.
Wow.
Which is especially interesting considering her previous statements alleging fraud related to mail-in ballots.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a head-scratcher.
It is.
Is he genuinely concerned about election security? Is it a calculated move to appeal to voters in key states?
Yeah.
Maybe a bit of both?
It's hard to say for sure, but it raises some important questions about the motivations behind these proposals and the potential implications for the future of elections.
Okay, well, you've given us a lot to think about already. But before we move on, we need to address the elephant in the room, the issue of voter fraud.
Right.
This has been so closely tied to Trump's rhetoric around election integrity.
Exactly, and Trump and his allies have repeatedly raised concerns about voter fraud, often pointing to very isolated incidents.
Okay.
Like the 2018 North Carolina primary, where there was proven tampering with absentee ballots.
Right.
However, it's important to note that these instances are outliers.
They're not the norm.
They aren't, and to your point, the Brennan Center conducted a study in 2017 that found the overall rate of voter fraud in the U.S. is incredibly low.
How low are we talking?
Less than 0.0009%.
Wow.
Even Ellen Weintraub, the head of the Federal Election Commission, has stated that there's simply no basis for the conspiracy theory that voting by mail causes fraud. So you're kind of left with the paradox.
Yeah.
You have these very isolated incidents being used to justify these sweeping changes,
Right.
despite the data suggesting that voter fraud is statistically insignificant.
Really makes you wonder about the true motivations behind these proposals.
It does, and it underscores the importance of critical thinking and careful analysis when evaluating these very complex issues.
Well, you've given us a lot to chew on in this first part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
We've unpacked Trump's proposals,
Uh-huh.
explored some initial concerns, and started to peel back the layers of this really multifaceted issue.
Yeah, and in the next part, we'll delve deeper into the potential consequences of these proposed changes and what they could mean for the future of American democracy.
I'm looking forward to that.
Me too.
All right, we'll see you then. So we've laid out Trump's proposed changes, and I think now we should dig into the potential consequences of these.
Right.
This isn't just theoretical, right? These changes could have a real impact on how elections actually work and who gets to participate.
Absolutely. The potential ripple effects are huge.
Yeah.
And I think we need to consider both the intended and unintended consequences.
Right.
So let's start with the move to one-day voting,
Okay.
arguably one of the most controversial aspects of his plan.
Yeah, it seems like a big change.
It is. Proponents argue that it enhances security and reduces the potential for fraud.
Okay.
But is that really the full picture?
Right, and I'm thinking back to that Reddit thread.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of people who were expressing concern that this change would really disproportionately impact working-class Americans.
Right.
Imagine someone who's juggling multiple jobs.
Yeah.
You know, finding the time to vote on a single Tuesday, potentially waiting in long lines.
Right.
That could be a real barrier for them.
It's a valid point, especially considering that Election Day isn't a national holiday in the U.S.
Right, exactly.
And if there are fewer polling places, as some have suggested,
Oh, yeah.
that could make voting even more challenging for people who have limited flexibility in their schedules.
And we can't forget about voters with disabilities.
Yeah.
For many, mail-in voting was a game changer in terms of accessibility.
Yeah, definitely.
And eliminating that option just seems like a step backward.
It's a huge concern that's been raised by disability rights advocates as well.
Right.
So it kind of begs the question,
What's that?
are these proposals truly about improving election security, or is there sort of another agenda at play?
What is the real purpose here?
Some argue that these changes are actually attempts at voter suppression,
Okay.
that they're aimed at making it harder for certain demographics to vote.
And that leads us to the voter ID and proof of citizenship requirements.
Right.
Supporters say they're necessary to prevent fraud, while critics say they're more about disenfranchising certain groups.
Right, and that's a key point of contention.
Okay, so both sides have very different views on that.
They do, and it's interesting because research has shown that voter fraud is actually incredibly rare in the United States.
Right. We talked about the Brennan Center study earlier,
Yeah,
which kind of debunked the myth of widespread fraud.
exactly.
So if the evidence doesn't support the claim that voter fraud is a major problem,
Right.
why the push for these stricter ID requirements?
Well, critics of these measures argue that they disproportionately impact minority voters,
Okay.
low-income individuals, and the elderly who might have more difficulty obtaining the required documentation.
So it seems like these proposals could be targeting the very groups that tend to vote for Democrats.
That's a conclusion that some have drawn, yes.
Okay.
They see this as a strategic move to suppress votes that might not favor a particular political party.
Interesting. And this isn't just speculation.
Right.
We've seen a wave of new voter ID laws in several states,
We have.
often coupled with cuts to early voting and other measures that restrict access.
It's true, and those trends have definitely set off alarm bells for voting rights advocates.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
They see it as a very real threat to the core principles of American democracy.
It is a sobering thought.
Yeah.
We've talked about the impact on individual voters.
Yeah.
But what about the broader implications?
Right.
What does Trump's push for these changes say about the state of American democracy?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It feels like it.
Some argue that it reflects a growing distrust in the electoral process, fueled by misinformation and these unsubstantiated claims of widespread fraud.
Right. It's almost like we're living in two different realities.
It does seem that way.
On the one hand, you have the data and experts saying that voter fraud is statistically insignificant.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have this narrative being pushed that the system is rigged.
And that narrative has gained a lot of traction,
It has.
influencing public opinion and shaping the political landscape.
And that's concerning.
It is.
Because when people lose faith in the system,
Right.
they're more likely to disengage
Yeah.
or turn to more extreme viewpoints.
Precisely. It can create this vicious cycle where distrust leads to disengagement, which further weakens these democratic institutions.
So where does that leave us, it seems like, with a lot of uncertainty?
It doesn't.
Is this a genuine effort to make elections more secure, or are we moving toward a more restrictive and less inclusive democracy?
Yeah. Those are the million-dollar questions.
They really are.
And unfortunately, there are no easy answers.
Yeah.
But I think what we can do is stay informed, engage in critical thinking, and participate in the democratic process to make sure our voices are heard.
You've given us a lot to consider in this deep dive.
Yeah.
It's a very complex issue with very high stakes,
Yeah, it is.
but it feels like we've only scratched the surface.
Yeah, I agree.
And in part 3, I'd love to explore the historical context of voting rights in America
Okay.
and see how these proposed changes align with or diverge from those precedents.
Right.
I have a feeling that will shed some light on where we are and where we might be headed.
It's definitely worth exploring.
Okay, so we've spent the last 2 parts really unpacking these Trump election proposals and the potential impacts.
Right.
But it feels like something's missing. Like,
Yeah.
we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture.
I agree. We need some historical context.
Yeah.
The evolution of voting rights in America has been a long and often turbulent journey.
Right. We can't fully grasp the significance of these proposals without understanding, the struggles and the progress that have really shaped our democracy.
Yeah.
I mean, early in U.S. history, the right to vote was incredibly limited.
Oh, absolutely.
It was mostly just white landowning men.
Right.
And it took decades of activism and social movements to expand that right to vote to more people.
Yeah. And it's easy to forget that women, African Americans, and other marginalized groups really had to fight hard for that right to vote.
Yeah, like the civil rights movement played a crucial role
Huge role.
in securing voting rights for African Americans.
Absolutely. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a landmark achievement.
Right?
It outlawed all these discriminatory voting practices like literacy tests and poll taxes that were really used to stop Black voters from voting.
And it sounds like the fight didn't end there.
Oh, definitely not. There have been ongoing efforts to kind of restrict access.
Right.
And a lot of times those efforts target communities of color and low-income populations.
Right. And that's where this historical context really hits home.
Yeah.
Because some people see these efforts as echoes of the Jim Crow era, attempts to undo the progress that's been made.
A disturbing thought. The idea that we could be going back to a system that actively stops citizens from voting based on their race or their income is deeply troubling.
So disturbing to think that we could be backsliding like that.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that voting rights are not guaranteed. It's an ongoing battle.
It really is.
It requires vigilance.
Now, bringing it back to Trump's proposals,
Right.
critics argue that they fit into this larger pattern of voter suppression,
Okay.
that it's a continuation of these efforts to restrict access and sort of tilt the playing field for partisan gain.
Right, and his persistent claims of this widespread voter fraud, despite the lack of evidence,
Yeah.
just really adds fuel to that argument,
It
It's
does.
like he's using this narrative to just sow this distrust in the system and justify these restrictive measures.
Yeah. It's a tactic that's been used throughout history. Using fear and misinformation to erode public trust can then make it easier to put in place policies that undermine democratic principles.
So we're back to our big question. What does Trump's push for these changes signal about the future of American democracy?
It's a tough question,
It is.
and I don't think there are any easy answers.
Right.
But what's clear is that these proposals have ignited this huge debate,
Yeah, definitely.
which reflects this deep divide that we have in our society over, what our democracy should look like.
Yeah, one side you have those who believe that stricter measures are necessary to ensure election integrity, even if it makes voting harder for some.
Right.
And then on the other side, you have those who see any attempt to restrict access as a direct attack on the right to vote.
Exactly. And I don't think this debate is going away anytime soon.
It feels like it's just getting started.
It is a battle over the soul of our nation.
Ah.
A struggle to define what kind of democracy we really want to be.
So what can we do as engaged citizens? How do we navigate all of this?
I think we need to educate ourselves about, the history of voting rights,
Right.
the tactics of voter suppression, and the potential impacts of these proposed changes.
Right? Knowledge is power.
It is,
Yeah.
and supporting organizations that are fighting to protect voting rights is so crucial,
Yeah.
and so is holding our elected officials accountable.
Right. Making sure they're representing us and representing our values.
Exactly, and above all, I think we can't be silent. We need to vote, contact our representatives, and engage in these dialogues to ensure that our democracy truly remains a government of, by, and for the people.
Well said. This deep dive has taken us through some really complex and often unsettling territory.
It has.
But it's so vital to grapple with these issues.
It is.
Question assumptions and never take our right to vote for granted.
The future of our democracy really depends on it.
Such a good point. And on that note, we wrap up this deep dive, keep those minds engaged, and we'll see you next time for another exploration into the topics that matter.